For 3,000 years, the tomb of Tutankhamun remained a silent, sealed world of gold and whispers. When that stone door was finally breached, the world held its breath, expecting unimaginable treasures. But what they discovered was far more profound and much stranger. They found evidence of a young king's fragility, the signs of hurried rituals, and a very human fear, frozen in time. Layer after layer of nested coffins, protective amulets, and elaborate shrines revealed not just a kingdom's wealth, but its desperation. Every single object told a story of anxiety, of haste, and of mortality. Inside that silent chamber, history itself seemed to pause, breathing through the artifacts. It was a quiet, haunting testament to the boy king who was once powerful, but ultimately mortal, vulnerable, and for millennia, forgotten. For 3,000 years, the air inside the tomb did not move. It had been trapped behind stone and ritual, holding its breath as the world outside changed, collapsed, and was utterly forgotten. When Howard Carter made the first small opening in 1922, the silence inside wasn't broken, it was disturbed. Dust that hadn't shifted since the Bronze Age trembled in the faint beam of his candle. Darkness that had never known electricity recoiled, and in that moment, Tutankhamun's tomb stopped being a legend and became something far more unsettling, a perfectly sealed human moment, preserved without mercy. Carter would later describe seeing wonderful things, but that simple phrase hides the profound unease of the discovery. What lay beyond the doorway wasn't just gold, it was order, careful placement, intentional stillness. This was not a tomb that had been robbed, reused, or neglected. This was a room frozen at the exact moment grief ended and sealing began. The ancient Egyptians had closed the door and walked away, believing their king would never be disturbed again. They were wrong. As they ventured further, the tomb itself felt smaller than expected. For a pharaoh, especially one buried with this level of wealth, the space felt almost apologetic. The corridors were narrow, the walls were close. The entire layout felt rushed, compressed, as if death had arrived far earlier than planned. This was the tomb of a ruler who lived long enough to meticulously prepare his final resting place. This was the tomb of someone taken suddenly, forcing priests, embalmers, and officials to improvise under immense pressure. Every step deeper into the tomb revealed this quiet contradiction. The objects were breathtakingly extravagant, but their arrangement was chaotic. Golden shrines were stacked one inside another, almost like desperate attempts to create distance between the living and the dead. Furniture leaned against walls at odd angles. Chariots were dismantled and crammed into corners, not ceremonially displayed. Everything suggested urgency, perhaps even fear, a desire to finish quickly and seal the door before something went wrong. And yet, nothing had gone wrong. That was the most unsettling part. Unlike nearly every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, this one had escaped the grasp of looters. There were no fingerprints of thieves, no smashed seals, no emptied chambers. The delicate wax seals on the inner doors still bore the unbroken mark of the royal necropolis. The tomb had been forgotten not because it lacked value, but because history itself had accidentally buried it under the debris of other construction projects, worker huts, and the sheer weight of time. Tutankhamun had survived not through power, but through obscurity. The boy king had ruled for only a short time. He left no grand monuments, no towering temples carved with victories. In fact, his name was nearly erased from history by his successors, who had no interest in remembering him. And yet, in death, he would become the most famous pharaoh who ever lived. Not because of what he did in life, but because of what was sealed with him in death. As Carter widened the opening and candlelight pushed inward, the objects began to emerge slowly from the gloom. Gold surfaces reflected the weak light back into the darkness, creating the eerie illusion of movement. Animal-headed beds seemed to watch from the shadows. Blackened statues stood guard, their eyes fixed on an eternity that had just been shattered. Gilded shrines, layered one inside another, promised even greater secrets within. This didn't feel like a museum. It felt like an intrusion, as if the tomb wasn't abandoned, but merely waiting. What made the discovery truly disturbing wasn't the wealth, but the intimacy. This was not a symbolic burial chamber, stripped down by time and ritual. This was a deeply private space. Personal belongings lay untouched, a pair of sandals, gloves, even the king's undergarments. These were things meant to be worn, not displayed. The tomb was never designed for visitors. It was designed for eternity. Eternity had just been interrupted. Even the walls told a restrained story. Unlike other royal tombs, which are filled with complex religious texts and magical spells, Tutankhamen's burial chamber walls were simple. The paintings were done quickly. The scenes were limited. There was no elaborate narrative of the afterlife, only the bare essentials. Again, the same message repeated itself. This burial was rushed. Deeper within, hidden behind layers of nested shrines, lay the sarcophagus itself. Each golden layer had to be dismantled carefully, one at a time, as if the ancient priests had tried to build a physical barrier against this very moment of disturbance. Gold leaf peeled away. Ancient wooden frames creaked, groaning as time itself resisted being undone. And somewhere, at the center of it all, lay a body that no one alive had seen since the New Kingdom. The idea that a human body could remain untouched for 3 millennia is unsettling on its own. But here, the body hadn't just survived, it had been intentionally preserved, ritualized and protected with obsessive care. Precious oils, resins, fine linens, amulets, and sheets of gold had been layered onto flesh, with a single purpose: to stop decay, to defeat time, to deny death its finality. But death always leaves its mark. The tomb was sealed, yes, but not perfectly. Subtle signs already hinted that something had gone wrong long before modern hands arrived. Blackened resin had overflowed from containers. Certain objects had shifted over time. The king's body itself, as they would later find, had become fused to its solid gold coffin by the hardened oils, resisting all attempts at separation. This was preservation taken too far, too fast. A burial done in haste, then locked away forever. Standing inside the tomb, Carter and his team were not just uncovering a king, they were uncovering an ancient anxiety, a fear of disorder, a fear of the gods, a fear of what might happen if the sacred rituals were not completed exactly, even under impossible circumstances. The tomb was less a monument to a king and more a containment chamber built, not only to protect the pharaoh, but to control what his sudden death represented. Outside, the world celebrated a magnificent discovery. Newspapers clamored with stories of treasure, of history, and of curses. But inside, the reality was quieter and far more disturbing. This tomb was not peaceful. It was tense. Every object felt like it had been placed with trembling hands. Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed to protect eternity. But eternity, they were discovering, was fragile. And as that first stone barrier fell, history did not roar out to greet them. It whispered, slowly, patiently, waiting for someone to finally listen. When Howard Carter first peered into Tutankhamun's tomb, his words became legendary, wonderful things. But as his eyes adjusted, what he saw wasn't just wonder, it was chaos. This was the antechamber, the first true revelation of the tomb, and it didn't feel ceremonial, it felt improvised. Objects were crowded into the space, as if they'd been carried in quickly, placed wherever there was room, and abandoned. Chariots were stacked against the walls, taken apart into awkward pieces. Ornate beds shaped like sacred animals stood on uneven ground, their legs bent under the immense weight of time. There was no symmetry, no calm order. This was not how eternity was supposed to look. The ancient Egyptians believed deeply in balance. They called it mat cosmic, or Durand. It was central to everything they did. A pharaoh's tomb was meant to be a perfect reflection of that balance, a machine designed to guide the dead safely into the afterlife. Yet here, inside Tutankhamun's tomb, that balance felt broken. The antechamber looked less like a sacred gateway and more like a storage unit sealed in a panic. It was the first strong sign that something had gone terribly wrong, long before Carter arrived. A fine, undisturbed layer of dust coated everything. There were no footprints crossing the floor, no broken seals to suggest a robbery. This chaos was original. It had been created by the ancient Egyptians themselves, not by thieves. That single realization changes the meaning of the entire room. This wasn't disorder caused by the slow march of time, it was disorder caused by extreme urgency. Each object told the same story. Take the chariots, for example. These weren't just ceremonial models. They were functional vehicles, disassembled simply to fit through the narrow corridor. Some even showed signs of wear and tear. Leather straps had stretched. The wood bore scratches from actual use. These were objects from Tutankhamun's life, not replicas made for his death. They had followed the boy king into his tomb because no one had time to replace them with proper symbolic substitutes. The burial had arrived far before the preparations were complete. The beds were even more revealing. Shaped like a cow, a lion, and a strange composite creature, they were meant to play key roles in resurrection rituals. Yet their placement was completely awkward. pushed against walls, and partially blocked by other items. Ritual requires space and precision. Here, there was neither. The priests had clearly done what they could, but they were working within severe limits, trying to adapt ancient beliefs to an uncooperative reality. Boxes filled with food, wine, oils, and personal items lined the room. Some were labeled hastily, others not at all. This wasn't a careful inventory for the afterlife. It was a desperate accumulation. Objects that might be useful were thrown in simply because excluding them felt too dangerous. When ritual certainty collapses, excess becomes a form of protection. Standing guard at the entrance to the burial chamber were two life-size statues of the king. Blackened and unnervingly human, they held staffs and gazed forward in eternal vigilance. Their presence felt deliberate. These weren't decorative figures, they were guardians. Their placement suggested a deep anxiety and attempt to block something from leaving, rather than to prevent something from entering. It seems the living feared a disturbance, an imbalance, maybe even a consequence for this rushed burial. Beyond the antechamber lay a sealed doorway, and it was here that the true weight of the situation became undeniable. The seal was intact, pressed with official insignia, untouched since the day it was closed thousands of years ago. Whatever lay beyond had not been seen since the final rites were completed. The chaotic antechamber now felt like a buffer space, designed to absorb all the disorder before it could reach the king himself. Suddenly, the tomb's strange layout made a new, unsettling kind of sense. This was not a grand royal architectural plan. It was a compromise. A smaller tomb, likely intended for a noble or a high-ranking court official, had been repurposed. Death had arrived too early, and the Valley of the Kings simply wasn't ready. This sense of urgency reshaped everything. The embalmers would have had to work faster. The priests would have been forced to abbreviate sacred rituals. The artisans had to adapt existing objects instead of creating new ones, and every single one of them would have known the risks. In ancient Egypt, mistakes in a burial weren't just symbolic errors, they were cosmic ones. A poorly prepared king could disrupt the fragile balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. The antechamber's disorder wasn't a sign of incompetence. It was a sign of fear-driven efficiency. Every object placed inside was an insurance policy against the unknown. Better to include too much than too little. Better to crowd the space than to risk leaving something essential behind. In a way, the living were protecting themselves just as much as they were protecting their king. Even the wine jars whispered of this urgency. Their labels recorded the king's regnal years, the vineyards, and the officials' names, yet some of these inscriptions were smudged, rushed, or incomplete. These were not offerings prepared over decades for a pharaoh's long reign. They were gathered quickly, pulled from royal storehouses, redirected from daily life into eternity without ceremony. The silence in that room was profound. For 3,000 years, darkness had pressed down on these objects, preserving not just their physical form, but the emotional state of the people who placed them there. Anxiety doesn't decay, fear doesn't rot. It settles into wood and linen and gold, and it waits. The antechamber wasn't a celebration of a glorious reign. It was a reaction to a crisis. And behind that sealed doorway, deeper still, lay the heart of that crisis, the burial chamber itself. Whatever story the antechamber told through its disorder, the inner chamber would tell through sheer excess. Shrines layered upon shrines, gold upon gold. Protection stacked so densely that even death itself would struggle to pass through. The tomb hadn't been sealed calmly. It had been sealed urgently. And the deeper Carter went, the clearer it became that Tutankhamun's death had not been expected, not been prepared for, and not been easily accepted by his people. The antechamber was history's first whisper of this truth, but the burial chamber, that would be its confession. When Howard Carter breached the sealed doorway into Tutankhamun's burial chamber, he wasn't just entering another room, he was crossing a threshold into a space heavy with intention. The air was warmer, tighter, and thick with the pressure of ritual. While the antechamber had been a jumble of beautiful but chaotically stored items, this room was different. It was obsessive. The chamber was almost completely consumed by a massive, overwhelming structure of gold and wood. For enormous gilded shrines, nested one inside the other like a set of Russian dolls, filled the space from wall to wall. There was barely enough room to walk around them. They hadn't been placed with elegance, but with a raw determination, as if the goal was to seal the king away as completely and securely as possible. Each shrine was covered in images of protective gods, their wings outstretched, their arms extended in gestures of containment. This wasn't just decoration, this was defense. Interestingly, the walls surrounding these golden behemoths were surprisingly plain compared to other royal tombs. They were painted quickly, with simpler scenes and fewer spells. The artwork focused narrowly on the moment of transition, the king greeting the gods, the king being embraced by them, the king being absorbed into the afterlife. There were no grand cosmic journeys depicted, no detailed maps of the underworld, just the arrival. The message was clear. There was no time to explain eternity, only to reach it. Inside the innermost shrine, Carter found a massive quartzite sarcophagus. Its corners were guarded by goddesses carved in high relief, their arms stretched protectively around the stone, their fingertips almost touching, forming a final, sacred barrier. But even here, the craftsmanship betrayed a sense of urgency. One corner of the sarcophagus had been damaged and repaired hastily. The heavy lid didn't fit perfectly. It seems precision had been sacrificed for speed. Lifting that heavy lid revealed a breathtaking sight. 3 coffins, one nestled inside the other. The outer 2 were made of gilded wood, darkened with age and ceremonial resins. But the innermost coffin was the true treasure. It was crafted from solid gold, heavy and intimate, molded to the exact shape of the young king's body. This wasn't just a symbolic container. It was a final, golden embrace, a second skin for eternity. But there was something else, something unusual about the chamber. The sheer quantity of resin, black, tar-like oils and unguents had been poured in amounts far greater than in any other tomb. They had saturated the linen wrappings, flowed over the coffins, and hardened into a solid mass. The intention was preservation, but the excessiveness bordered on panic. The embalmers were in a desperate race against time, heat, and decay. In their haste, they sealed the body so completely that it fused to the bottom of its golden coffin, resisting even the careful hands of modern excavators. It was an act of preservation born from fear. And then there were the amulets, hundreds of them, tucked between the layers of linen, pressed against the chest, placed under the arms. Each had a specific purpose: to protect the heart, to guide the soul, to prevent the body from speaking against itself in the final judgment. This wasn't just protection, it was overprotection. It hinted at a deep-seated uncertainty, a fear that the proper rituals hadn't been fully completed, or that the king's body was in the ideal condition for its journey to the afterlife. The burial chamber wasn't a place of peaceful rest. It was tense. Every object was pressed against another, every surface layered with urgent meaning. There was no space left for second thoughts, no room for hesitation. Once the final rites were spoken, the shrines were sealed, the door was blocked, and the tomb was abandoned. Whatever mistakes had been made were now permanent. And there were mistakes. The pooled resin had scorched parts of the coffin. Linen had stuck where it shouldn't have. The king's body, locked in place by the hardened oils, showed signs of this desperate haste. Death had not waited for perfection. Even the iconic golden mask, the face meant to immortalize the boy king, held a secret. Later analysis revealed that it likely wasn't originally made for Tutankhamun. Subtle differences in the inscriptions and fittings suggest it had been adapted, repurposed from an earlier royal burial. Even his eternal identity had been adjusted under pressure. The burial chamber tells a story of compression. It's a story of a grand eternal ritual forced into a limited space, of eternity squeezed into a room barely large enough to hold it. The massive shrines weren't arranged to be admired. They were built to deny access, to create a final, impenetrable fortress around the king. It was a lock, a desperate attempt to ensure that nothing escaped, not the king's spirit, not the mistakes made in haste, and not the truth of his sudden, untimely death. The Egyptians believed that a king's death, if not handled correctly, could destabilize the entire cosmos. The sudden passing of the boy king put enormous pressure on those responsible for his burial. The result wasn't elegance, but excess. It wasn't clarity, but containment. In this sacred space, gold wasn't a symbol of confidence. It was a shield. The resin wasn't an act of reverence. It was a sign of panic. Layer upon layer of protection revealed not assurance, but profound doubt. At the very center of it all, surrounded by nested shrines and a heavy silence, Tutankhamun lay sealed in place, his body pressed into eternity before anyone was truly ready. The door was closed. The seals were stamped. The Valley of the Kings returned to its quiet slumber. And for over 3,000 years, the burial chamber held its breath, perfectly preserving a single moment of royal panic for the entire world to one day discover. Beyond the grand spectacle of Tutankhamun's burial chamber past, the shimmering gold shrines and nested coffins, lighter rooms that tell a much more human story. These are the side chambers, almost hidden, easily overlooked. Compared to the overwhelming divine authority of the main chamber, these spaces feel strangely intimate. They are smaller, darker, less ceremonial. These were not rooms designed to impress the gods. They were made to serve a human being who was expected to simply continue existing. If the burial chamber was about containment, these side rooms were about survival. The first of these rooms, later named the treasury, strikes a different emotional chord. Here, ritual objects replace furniture, and symbolism overtakes practicality. At its center stands a magnificent golden shrine, guarded by 4 goddesses with outstretched, protective arms, mirroring those in the burial chamber. Inside this shrine is the canopic chest, and within that chest, the king's internal organs, preserved separately but protected with obsessive care. For the Egyptians, the body had to remain whole in function, even if it was separated in form. Death didn't end responsibility, it multiplied it. But even here, in this sacred space, signs of haste are impossible to ignore. The canopic shrine is exquisitely made, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but the objects surrounding it are crowded together, unevenly placed. Model boats, ritual statues, chests filled with precious materials, and food offerings all compete for space. It feels less like a carefully planned arrangement and more like a last-minute consolidation of necessities, a frantic gathering of everything the king might need. One object stands apart from all others, a haunting statue of Anubis. The jackal-headed god, rendered in stark black, is alert and watchful. He rests atop his own shrine, facing the entrance, his posture rigid. This isn't just passive protection. Anubis was the god of embalming, the guardian of the dead, and the guide through the treacherous paths of the underworld. It's as if the living stationed a guard between themselves and the king's remains, afraid of what might happen if the boundaries between worlds failed. Nearby, a small chest contains objects that blur the line between ritual and medicine. Ointments, resins, and various substances meant to heal or preserve were included in abundance. These weren't just symbolic gestures. They were practical responses to a body that had not been strong in life and might not endure the trials of death. The act of preservation here feels less like a confident ritual and more like a desperate hope against hope. The second side room, now known as the annex, is even more revealing. It's a scene of chaos. The room is disorderly to the point of being uncomfortable. Objects lie piled on top of one another, with no apparent system. Broken pieces of pottery are mixed in with luxury items. Jars of food are scattered about. Ornate furniture pieces lean awkwardly against the walls. This room feels like it was abandoned in the middle of a frantic rush, as if the workers were interrupted and never had a chance to return and tidy up. The annex was not a ceremonial space. It was a storage room, and one that exposes the improvisation behind the entire burial. Supplies meant to sustain the king in the afterlife had been thrown together, prioritized by what was available, not by their symbolic importance. The message is unmistakable. There simply had not been enough time. The rush to seal the tomb was paramount, and it's here, among the clutter, that we find everyday items that quietly dissolve the majestic image of divine kingship. There are linen garments, sandals worn thin from use, intricate gaming boards, and personal containers. These objects had been used. They carry the imprint of human touch. They tell us that the king was not entering eternity as an abstract god-king. He was entering it as a boy who had lived a brief and imperfect life. Walking canes appear again here, dozens of them, reinforcing a pattern that can no longer be ignored. These were not decorative symbols of power. They were practical aids. Their presence across multiple rooms suggests an ongoing, daily physical difficulty, a weakness that was accommodated in life and had to be accounted for even in death. This wasn't a vulnerability that would be acknowledged publicly, but it was recognized privately, carefully factored into the preparations for his final journey. These side chambers strip away the illusions. The main burial chamber was about projecting authority and ensuring divine protection, but the side rooms, they were about need. They revealed that Tutankhamun wasn't buried as an invincible, godlike king, but as a vulnerable young man whose body and afterlife required constant assistance. The space is filled with food offerings, bread, dried meat, fruit, wine, enough to sustain the king indefinitely, according to belief. Yet the jars themselves vary in quality. Some were clearly repurposed from other uses. The labels are inconsistent. This isn't the abundance of confidence. It's the abundance born from a fear of forgetting something crucial. What makes these rooms so unsettling is their raw honesty. There's no golden mask here to distract you, no monumental shrine to overwhelm your senses. There are just objects, piled in the darkness, waiting. They carry the emotional residue of the people who placed them. They're people racing against the clock, against the natural process of decay, against the possibility of ritual failure and divine judgment. The ancient Egyptians believed that if anything essential was missing from a burial, the deceased could suffer for all eternity. The side chambers were their insurance policy. They were apologies made in advance. They were the living admitting, without words, that this burial was imperfect. And yet, despite the chaos, nothing was taken. Nothing was disturbed for over 3,000 years. The side chambers remained sealed, their disorder preserved exactly as it had been left. Time didn't correct the chaos. It froze it, turning it into a permanent record of a moment of crisis. These rooms reveal a truth that the magnificent burial chamber tried to hide. Tutankhamun's death was not an orderly, planned event. It was managed. The side chambers whisper of exhaustion, of rituals performed late into the night, of decisions made under immense pressure. They speak of a body that did not behave as a divine king's should, of a king who needed more than just symbolism to survive eternity. And when that final door was sealed, these rooms with all their chaotic contents were abandoned, along with the boy king, himself left to carry the quiet confession of a burial done too fast for someone who died too young and under a shadow of fear. Deep within the golden heart of Tutankhamun's tomb, beneath layers of unimaginable wealth and sacred ritual, lay the most honest artifact of all, the body of the king himself. But this was not the serene, godlike figure the world imagined. When archaeologists finally reached the innermost coffin, they discovered a scene of desperate haste. The mummy wasn't resting peacefully. It was trapped. A thick, black, tar-like substance coated everything. The embalmers, in their rush to preserve and protect the young king for his journey to the afterlife, had poured excessive amounts of resin into the coffin. Over the millennia, this resin had hardened, gluing the king's fragile body to his golden sarcophagus. Time, heat, and haste had fused linen, flesh, and gold into a single, immovable mass. The very act meant to ensure his rebirth had instead sealed him in a permanent prison. This was not the meticulous, perfected art of royal mummification. As the layers of linen wrappings were painstakingly examined, the signs of urgency were everywhere. The careful symmetry expected in a pharaoh's burial was gone. Amulets were pressed into the body at strange, uneven angles. Bandages overlapped haphazardly. It was as if the embalmers were frantically packing protection into every possible space, terrified the body wouldn't survive the journey otherwise. The entire burial felt compressed, rushed, and heavy with unspoken anxiety. Subtle fractures and distortions spoke of a body that had never been strong. This wasn't a robust ruler struck down in his prime. This was someone who had been fragile long before death ever came for him. The story continued down the length of his body. One leg was severely damaged, with a bone fracture so severe it likely happened right around the time of his death. Crucially, there were no signs of healing. This wasn't an old injury he'd recovered from. It was fresh and potentially fatal. In an era without antibiotics, a compound fracture like that would have led to a swift and deadly infection, especially in a body already weakened by other ailments. The embalmers had tried to stabilize the limb, wrapping and padding it tightly, but their work again showed speed over precision. It was an act of containment, not healing. And there was more. Quietly, the bones whispered other secrets: deformities in his feet, a curved spine, a bone density far lower than a young man's should be. Suddenly, the hundreds of walking canes found scattered throughout the tomb were no longer just symbolic emblems of power. They were necessities. The boy king, Tutankhamun, had ruled an empire while living in constant pain. The heart, the most important organ for judgment in the afterlife, was either missing or had been displaced. Explanations range from ritual deviation to accidental damage during the hasty embalming, but none of them suggest a smooth, confident process. The embalmers were improvising, adapting to problems as they arose, bending the sacred rules under immense pressure. The body simply wasn't cooperating. modern science has since peeled back even more layers. DNA analysis and CT scans revealed a cocktail of afflictions, traces of malaria, the most severe strain, and genetic conditions likely born from generations of royal inbreeding. Tutankhamun's death wasn't a sudden, tragic event. The public image of a vital, divine king was a carefully constructed facade, while the real body beneath it slowly failed. It rewrote his story of weakness and pain into one of eternal, flawless power. The tragic irony is that the ancient embalmer's haste led to modern destruction. When Howard Carter's team tried to remove the mummy from its coffin, the hardened resin refused to yield. To separate the body from the gold, they had to use force, causing irreversible damage. This destruction wasn't ancient, but it was a direct consequence of the fragile prison created 3,000 years earlier. The mummy reveals not only how Tutankhamun died, but how he lived, constrained, managed, and perpetually fragile. His body was preserved with desperation, not confidence. The embalmers didn't trust biology to take its course. They tried to overwhelm it with ritual and resin. And in doing so, they accidentally preserved something else, their own fear. This is the true secret of the tomb, not a curse, not just wealth, but the physical record of a system under stress. It's the story of religion confronting a harsh reality, of sacred ritual colliding with a body that refused to conform. The king's death came too soon. His body was too weak. His burial was a frantic race against time. And yet, every effort was made to hide this truth beneath breathtaking layers of splendor. But the body could not lie. It carried the fractures, the disease, and the pain. It held the story that the golden shrines and majestic masks tried so hard to suppress. Sealed in darkness for 3 millennia, it waited, not to accuse, but to whisper a fundamental truth. The boy king didn't die a glorious god, he died a human. And his body, fused to gold and resin, remains the most honest and poignant artifact in the entire tomb. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the past. When we think of Tutankhamun, we picture gold, the golden mask, the golden coffins, the glittering treasures. We see a story of wealth, power, and ancient mystery. But the real story of his tomb isn't about treasure, it's about fear. It's a political thriller, a cover-up engineered to save an empire from itself. To understand why, we have to go back to the world Tutankhamun was born into. It was a kingdom in chaos. His predecessor, Akhenaten, had turned Egypt upside down. He abandoned the traditional gods, moved the capital, and shattered centuries of religious belief. When Akhenaten died, the kingdom was fractured, angry, and unstable. Into this crisis stepped a child Tut. His very name was later changed to Tutankhamun, to signal a return to the old ways, a healing of the nation's wounds. He wasn't a powerful ruler, he was a symbol of reconciliation. He was politically essential, but personally fragile. Behind the palace walls, everyone in power knew the truth. The boy king was not strong. He was often sick, suffering from a bone disease that forced him to walk with a cane. His authority didn't come from strength, but from the powerful men who surrounded him: priests, generals, and courtiers like Ai and Horemheb. They were the ones really running the country, governing in his name. Then, at just 19 years old, the king died. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political time bomb. There was no clear heir, no adult son to take the throne. The line of succession was broken. Any sign of weakness or instability could reignite the religious conflicts Akhenaten had started. The court's worst nightmare was coming true. The fragile king was gone, leaving a power vacuum. Silence became their strategy. Speed became their weapon. The faster they could bury Tutankhamun, the faster they could control the story. This urgency explains everything about his strange burial. Why was the tomb so small and rushed? Because they were in a hurry. Why were so many objects repurposed from other pharaohs? Because there was no time to make new ones. Why was his mummy covered in an unusually thick layer of black resin? Perhaps it was a desperate attempt to speed up the ritual process of transforming him into a god. The burial wasn't a loving tribute, it was damage control. The goal was to erase the image of a weak, sickly boy and replace it with that of an eternal, divine ruler. They needed to lock away the uncomfortable truth of his reign. This is why his tomb walls tell us so little about his life. There are no great battles, no inscriptions boasting of his accomplishments. The decorations only show his journey to the afterlife, a quiet, seamless transition from life to eternity. History was being edited in real time. The men who buried him were the ones who benefited. A smooth, orderly burial implied divine approval. Divine approval legitimized the next ruler. And who would that ruler be? Look closely at the tomb paintings. The figure performing the opening of the mouth ceremonia ritual, usually done by a son for his father, is an elderly court official. This wasn't a tribute, it was a political statement. I was staking his claim to the throne, using the king's burial as the stage for his own coronation. After the General Horemheb seized power, he went even further. He erased Tutankhamun and Akhenaten from the official king lists, pretending they never existed. He wanted to completely sever ties with this troubled period of history. The boy king, whose tomb would one day become the most famous in the world, was deliberately written out of his own story. The irony is staggering. The court's primary goal was to preserve the narrative of divine, unbroken power. A fragile king didn't fit that story, so they buried the truth along with his body. Even the iconic golden mask is part of this political theater. It presents an idealized image of a calm, healthy, godlike youth, everything the real Tutankhamun was not. It's propaganda in death. The fear wasn't simply that a king had died. The fear was what his death revealed. That the throne of Egypt had been held by a boy whose body and authority were too weak to carry the weight of an empire. The burial was an act of containment. Contained the body, contained the story, contained the political risk. And for 3,000 years, it worked. Tutankhamun's name was forgotten. His tomb disappeared under the sand and rubble of the Valley of the Kings. The secret of his weakness was so well kept that history itself forgot him, until Howard Carter's discovery in 1922. When that tomb was opened, it didn't just reveal treasure, it exposed the lie. The meticulously crafted silence of the court finally shattered. In the golden artifacts and the rushed burial, we can now read the story they tried so hard to hide, a story of fragility, political maneuvering, and the incredible lengths a civilization would go to preserve the illusion of perfection. Tutankhamun's tomb was not a celebration, it was a solution to a crisis, and it reminds us that history is often shaped not by what we choose to remember, but by what we desperately try to forget. When the tomb was opened, the ancient fear did not remain buried, it simply changed shape. What had once been anxiety over cosmic order became modern obsession, sensationalism, and dread. The silence that had protected Tutankhamun for 3,000 years was replaced by whispers of a curse. The idea spread quickly, almost eagerly. A sealed tomb, a dead king, sudden illness, death following discovery. The story wrote itself before the facts could even interfere. Newspapers, hungry for a compelling narrative, prioritized mystery over accuracy. And the public, it turned out, needed something to fear. Tutankhamun, a pharaoh erased in antiquity, was reborn as a chilling warning. The myth was sealed by the death of Lord Carnarvon. He was the man who had financed the entire excavation, who had stood by Howard Carter through years of frustrating failure, and who finally stood at the threshold of history. Just months after the tomb's opening, he died. The cause: blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite. In that era, it was a tragically common way to die. But coincidence is fertile ground for fear. A new story immediately took root. The tomb had struck back. Soon, other deaths were selectively added to the narrative. A radiologist who examined the mummy, a visitor who suddenly fell ill, a few members of the excavation team who passed away years later from completely unrelated causes. The details didn't matter. What was ignored was the longevity of so many others. Survival, after all, is uninteresting. The myth of the curse required casualties. What was rarely mentioned was how many people lived long, full lives after entering the tomb. Howard Carter himself, the man who first broke the seal, lived for nearly 2 decades after his monumental discovery. Most of the local workers who spent countless hours inside the tomb suffered no ill effects whatsoever. But a good curse doesn't survive on facts. It survives on atmosphere. And Tutankhamun's tomb provided the perfect stage. It had been sealed for millennia. It had been violated. And the body inside, it seemed, had not rested peacefully. Layers of resin, fractures on the bones, and damage from modern handling created an image of disturbance layered upon disturbance. The idea that the dead king might lash out in response felt emotionally satisfying, even if it was completely irrational. But beneath the superstition, something far more subtle and more disturbing was at play. Ancient tombs are biological time capsules. Mold, bacteria, and other pathogens can lie dormant in sealed environments for centuries, even millennia. When Carter's team broke the seal, fresh air and humidity reactivated these dormant spores. It's no surprise that some early visitors experienced respiratory symptoms, coughing, and illness. In an era before antibiotics, even a minor infection could quickly become fatal. The curse, it turns out, was not supernatural, it was environmental. A biological ghost, not a royal one. Still, fear had already done its work. The narrative had shifted away from the realities of politics, disease, and human fragility, and moved toward a story of supernatural punishment. The boy king was no longer seen as a weak, sickly ruler. He was powerful again. The myth restored what history had taken from him, his authority. In a strange way, this shift was comforting. It's much easier to believe that a mighty pharaoh killed intruders than to confront the reality that he had been a sick child, managed by adults, and buried in a rush. The curse reclaimed his dignity by transforming his vulnerability into vengeance. Even Howard Carter, a man of science and a skeptic of the curse, understood its usefulness. The mystery protected the site. Fear was a better deterrent for looters than any security guard could be. Silence returned to the valley, but in a different, more sensational form. The public imagination ran wild, reshaping the tomb yet again. Films, novels, and sensational lectures exaggerated the danger. The stunning golden mask, an object meant for protection in the afterlife, became an icon of menace. The boy king's humanity faded beneath layers of myth, just as his body had once been hidden beneath layers of resin. The curse also provided a convenient cover for something else: the damage done by the excavators themselves. The process of removing the mummy from its sarcophagus was not a delicate one. The hardened resins had glued the body to the coffin. In their haste to get to the treasures beneath, the team caused fractures. Limbs were separated. The fragile bones were stressed. Tutankhamun's body arguably suffered more harm in the 20th century than it had in the 3 millennia it lay undisturbed. But the story of a curse provided a perfect cover. The damage wasn't their fault, it was destiny. This pattern was not accidental. Once again, a powerful narrative was being used to protect established systems. In antiquity, the fear of divine disorder was used to seal and protect the tomb. In modernity, the fear of a supernatural curse shielded scientific institutions from scrutiny and questions about their methods. The story of Tutankhamun's tomb has always been about control. The irony is almost painful. Tutankhamun, a king whose life had been defined by physical weakness and political dependency, was now imagined as an unstoppable, vengeful force. Death gave him the dominance that life had always denied him, but the tomb itself, the physical space, resisted that transformation. It continued to offer quieter truths to those willing to look past the myth. The cramped chambers, the rushed burial, the excessive and messy application of resin, the broken body, none of these spoke of a wrathful king. They spoke of fear, miscalculation, and loss at the time of his death. The curse narrative did something else as well. It reburied the boy king, not in stone this time, but in fiction. His real story, the story of a young man caught in a turbulent political and religious era, retreated once more, hidden behind spectacle and sensation. And yet, science continued its quiet work. CT scans, DNA analysis, and modern forensic studies slowly began to dismantle the myth, piece by piece. Illness replaced magic, mold replaced malice, politics replaced punishment. The tomb started whispering again, not of vengeance, but of vulnerability. Still, the curse lingers. It persists in our collective imagination, because curses are not about truth, they are about emotion. They satisfy a deep-seated need to believe that death has agency, that violating a sacred space has consequences, and that the past can somehow reach forward and touch us. In that sense, the curse was never really about Tutankhamun at all. It was about us. It was about our discomfort with disturbing the dead, our discomfort with our own fragility, our discomfort with the idea that even powerful kings can be utterly powerless. The tomb was originally sealed to suppress the weakness of a failed dynasty. The curse revived that story, but repackaged it as power. Fear protected the myth, but the truth remained, patient and undisturbed, waiting for those willing to listen beyond the noise. And in the quiet after the headlines faded, the tomb resumed its whispering, soft, persistent, and deeply human. For decades, the story of Tutankhamun was one of curses and conspiracies. When his tomb was discovered, the world saw only gold, mystery, and a boy king struck down in his prime. But after the headlines faded and the treasures were catalogued, something quieter arrived. Science. It didn't come with drama or reverence, it came with patience. The first challenge was the mummy itself. Damaged during its removal from the sarcophagus, the body was broken, the limbs separated, the bones stressed by hardened resin. Every attempt to study the king risked destroying what was left. It was a paradox. To understand, we had to disturb, but disturbance could erase the very information we sought. Early X-rays were the first glimpse beneath the linen and gold. They revealed fractures, igniting a new debate. Was the king murdered? A blow to the head, some said. Others argued the damage happened during embalming or even by the archaeologists themselves. The truth, however, refused to be so dramatic. It hid in ambiguity. But what science did reveal with certainty was weakness. Bone density scans showed a body that had never fully developed strength. His left leg and foot were malformed, making every step painful and unstable. Suddenly, the hundreds of canes found in his tomb weren't just symbols of power. He needed them to walk. Tutankhamun wasn't striding through his palace. He was leaning on a stick, just to move. Then came the DNA analysis, which deepened the discomfort. The golden blood of the pharaohs came at a terrible price. Generations of royal inbreeding had left their mark. Genetic disorders weakened Tutankhamun's immune system, compromised his bone development, and left him vulnerable. The very purity that made him divine also made him fragile. The final piece of the puzzle was malaria. Scientists found traces of the parasite in his tissue, evidence of repeated severe infections. For a healthy person, malaria is survivable. But for a young man, already weakened by genetic disorders and a clubfoot, it was a death sentence. Add a severe leg fracture, possibly from a fall, which then became infected, and the picture becomes grimly clear. There was no need for a dramatic conspiracy, no poison, no assassin in the shadows. The king's body told a simpler, quieter story. Accumulation, weakness layered upon weakness, until the entire system just failed. But science didn't strip away all the mystery. In fact, it highlighted something the ancient Egyptians seemed to know all along. The hasty burial, the excessive amounts of resin poured over the body, the overabundance of protective amulets. It wasn't just ritual. It was a desperate attempt to fix what was broken. The embalmers knew something was profoundly wrong with this king. Even if they couldn't name the biology, their actions were driven by an intuition that a body that struggled in life needed more help in death. Science didn't contradict the tomb. It finally allowed us to understand it. Even the iconic golden mask took on a new meaning. It was no longer just a symbol of divine perfection. It was an act of deliberate concealment. An idealized, powerful face placed over a fragile, damaged skull. It wasn't deception. It was compensation. The mask gave the king the strength and depth that his body never had in life. CT scans showed how tightly the mask and coffins were fitted, immobilizing him. Eternity had to be rigid, perfect, and unforgiving, because his life was anything but. The more data we gathered, the less heroic the story became, but the more human it felt. Tutankhamun wasn't cursed or murdered. He was a boy born into a system that demanded perfection and denied weakness. His body simply broke under that pressure. And yet, questions remain. Science can explain the illness, but it can't explain the fear that permeates the tomb. The haste, the repurposed objects, the unusual burial choices. To the ancient Egyptians, a damaged pharaoh threatened the cosmic balance of the universe. Tutankhamun's physical state, combined with his sudden death, must have terrified them. Science shows us the cause. The tomb preserves their panicked reaction. In this way, modern technology became a bridge, connecting biological truth to cultural belief. The genetic weakness explains the canes, the malaria explains the early death. The broken body explains the frantic, resin-soaked burial. Nothing supernatural was needed. The tomb had never lied. We just weren't listening to the right story. Tutankhamun's legacy isn't about what he ruled, but what he reveals. That even the most powerful societies cannot escape biology. That the most elaborate rituals cannot undo fragility. His tomb has become a mirror, reflecting not ancient Egypt's power, but its profound anxiety, its desperate need to appear eternal in a world where everything, even a king, eventually breaks. The gold is still beautiful, the mask is still iconic, but beneath it all, the truth is quieter and far more unsettling. The boy king was not prepared for death, and as it turns out, neither was history. By the time science could finally speak with any certainty, Tutankhamun had already escaped history. He had entered something far more powerful, public memory, not the careful, catalogued memory of scholars, but the deep, emotional memory of all of us. His tomb didn't just change archaeology because of what it proved, but because of how it made people feel. Before Tutankhamun, ancient Egypt was a world of distant ruins and cryptic inscriptions. After him, it became intimate, personal, human. The discovery shifted the entire field of archaeology away from abstract theories and towards the raw reality of lives interrupted. When people looked into those display cases, they didn't just see a dynasty. They saw a pair of sandals worn thin at the heel. They saw the body of a young man, broken and buried in a hurry. The past suddenly stopped feeling so far away. Museums even changed how they talked about these things. Gold wasn't just displayed as a marvel of craftsmanship anymore. It was about proximity. People stood just inches away from objects that were meant to last for eternity and had this profound realization: eternity had failed. The boy king became a bridge, connecting our own modern vulnerability with the anxieties of the ancient world. The discovery also taught archaeology a hard lesson in caution. The damage done during those early, frantic examinations became a story written in bone. The resin that was meant to preserve the body now punished any hasty attempt to study it. Every broken limb, every separated joint was a stark reminder that discovery can also destroy. From that tomb forward, archaeology learned the value of restraint. The field also learned a bit of humility. In the grand scheme of Egyptian history, Tutankhamun wasn't a major player. His reign was short, unremarkable, and mostly managed by others. And yet, his small, hidden tomb revealed more about ancient Egypt's soul than the grand monuments of many great pharaohs combined. It showed how power scrambles to respond to weakness, how entire systems work to conceal failure, how elaborate rituals are used to cover up deep-seated fear. Suddenly, historians started paying attention to the silences. What wasn't written down in the official records? What was done in a rush? What was deliberately hidden away? Tutankhamun's tomb taught us that absence can often speak louder than any inscription, that the smallest tombs can hold the most enormous truths, and that forgotten kings are sometimes remembered precisely because they reveal the secrets that the successful ones managed to conceal. The public's fascination never faded because the story never truly ended. There was no final, neat answer to how he died. There was no clean villain to blame, no triumphant explanation to close the book. This ambiguity became a kind of mirror. Every generation found its own meaning in that tomb. For some, it was a chilling warning about disturbing the past. For others, it was a powerful lesson in the need for scientific patience. For many more, it became a quiet meditation on mortality itself. The boy king aged in our collective memory, while his image remained eternally young. His fragility made him relatable in a way that no conquering pharaoh, with all their power, ever could be. He didn't dominate history, he endured it. His tomb also forced modern culture to face an uncomfortable truth. Perfection has always been an illusion. We often imagine ancient Egypt as this rigid, monolithic, eternal civilization, but Tutankhamun's burial showed it to be improvisational, fearful, and deeply messily human. Their rituals weren't guarantees against death. They were desperate attempts to control it, attempts to preserve an identity, attempts to deny the reality of decay. The golden mask became the perfect symbol of this contradiction. On the surface, it was flawless, symmetrical, divine, but beneath it lay a body that was none of those things. The mask wasn't a reflection of reality, it was a compensation for it. And in that way, Tutankhamun's tomb stopped being just about ancient Egypt and started being about all of us. Our modern societies do the exact same thing. We hide our own weaknesses behind polished surfaces. We rush to find easy solutions. We are terrified of being exposed. The tomb felt familiar because its psychology was our own. It was shaped by fear. It was protected by a story. And it was preserved by time. Even the endless debates about how he died reveal more about us than they do about him. We crave drama. We want murder, curses, and epic meaning. The simple idea that a king could just fall ill, that his body could fail, feels unsatisfying. It's too ordinary. It feels too close to home. But that ordinariness is the entire point. Tutankhamun matters because he shows us that power does not cancel out vulnerability, that youth is no guarantee of strength, and that systems built on the idea of perfection are at their most fragile when they reconfronted with simple, imperfect reality. As the exhibitions of his treasures traveled the world, millions of people stood before the artifacts and felt something very specific, but difficult to name. It wasn't just awe, and it wasn't fear. It was something quieter, a sense of recognition. This wasn't the tomb of a god, it was the tomb of a boy surrounded by adults who tried their best to make his death orderly, meaningful, and Siflin failed in small, but incredibly revealing ways. A boy whose body just couldn't meet the impossible expectations placed upon it. A boy whose burial exposed the absolute limits of belief. In the end, the tomb reshaped how history itself is told. It made room for weakness, for error, and for unfinished lives. It reminded us that greatness isn't always loud, and that influence isn't always intentional. Tutankhamun didn't shape history while he was alive. Instead, history shaped itself around him long after he was gone. And perhaps that is why his tomb still whispers to us today, not to warn and not to threaten, but to remind us that even the most powerful cultures are just human constructions, that our own rituals are just responses, not solutions, and that while gold can preserve beautiful objects, it can never preserve certainty. The tomb survived because it was forgotten, and when it was remembered, it taught the world something that ancient Egypt itself may have been too afraid to admit, that eternity is only ever an aspiration, never a guarantee, and that beneath every perfect monument, there is always a body. When we think of Tutankhamun's tomb, we picture gold, mountains of it, the iconic death mask, nested golden shrines, glittering chariots. We imagine a space screaming with power, wealth, and divine right. But what if the tomb's loudest statement is actually a whisper? What if the most profound story isn't told by the gold, but by the silence? Let's journey past the dazzling artifacts, beyond the antechamber and side rooms, to the final layer, the burial chamber itself. This room doesn't command attention. It's quiet, almost unassuming. It's a space defined not by what it contains, but by what it preserves, a truth that has waited over 3,000 years to be heard. By the time Howard Carter's team began their meticulous study, every object, every crack in the plaster, every layer of resin had become a piece of evidence, a record of both intention and error. They discovered the tomb wasn't just a pristine resting place for a god-king. It was a chronicle of a very human response to fragility, to fear, and to the one thing even pharaohs couldn't escape, mortality. The side chambers, the antechamber, the burial chamber, they all tell the same story in slightly different ways. This boy king was mortal, and those around him were scrambling, acting as if every ritual, every prayer, every piece of gold could somehow stave off the inevitable. The artifacts themselves speak more clearly than any hieroglyph. Look closer. The dozens of canes placed with the body hint at a lifelong disability, a young man who likely walked with a limp. The linen garments, though carefully folded, are crowded into chests, suggesting urgency and improvisation. They were running out of time, and the gold, the sheer density of it, layers upon layers of gold, so thick that the resin used to anoint the mummy, fused the king's body to his golden coffin. This wasn't just ritual. This was a record of anxiety, desperation masquerading as devotion. Every element in this tomb is a testament to the pressure cooker environment in which it was created. The tomb's silence isn't emptiness. It's a presence. It's so thick you can almost feel it. It allows us to connect with the panic, the care, and the frantic improvisation of those who prepared this burial. They were acting under immense pressure, political pressure to secure the succession, religious pressure to ensure the king's journey to the afterlife, and the cosmic pressure of upholding the entire order of the universe. And yet, despite the rush, despite the clear errors, like the microbial spots on the walls, evidence the paint hadn't even dried when the tomb was sealed, they created something truly extraordinary. Not perfection, but endurance. Not a guarantee of immortality, but an incredible act of preservation. Beneath the gold, beneath the resin, beneath the amulets and shrines, lies the king himself. A body that was small, fragile, and achingly human. For centuries, this central fact has been overlooked, misinterpreted, and sensationalized. He became a legend, a myth, a curse, but the body remains. A quiet, persistent reminder that history isn't just about power, wealth, or conquest. It's also about limitations, about fear, about our very human attempts to impose order on a universe that is fundamentally uncontrollable. Even the myths that exploded around the discovery, the infamous curse of the pharaohs, the sensational headlines, the stories of supernatural vengeance, they can't erase that fundamental fact. These stories overlay drama onto reality, but they can't change the truth. Tutankhamun was a boy. He died young. His body was weak. His burial was hurried. And yet, it is through that very imperfection that his tomb survived, untouched for millennia. Through that imperfection, it now speaks to anyone willing to listen. The legacy of this tomb is a paradox. On one hand, it completely reshaped modern culture, inspiring awe, fashion, and a global fascination with ancient Egypt. On the other hand, it forced archaeology and science to confront their own limitations. What can really be preserved? What can be truly understood across thousands of years? And what will always remain unknowable? The gold may shine, but it can't hide the human truth beneath it. The body, the haste, the improvisational, these details whisper across the millennia, reminding us of our own mortality and the fragility of even the grandest ambitions. So what makes this tomb so enduring? It's not the glitter of the treasure. It's not the fame of a boy king who ruled for a short time and was quickly forgotten by his own people. And it's not the drama of curses. It is that quiet, patient, human truth, waiting beneath all the layers of ritual and story. For 3,000 years, it held still. Now, after being discovered, studied, and mythologized, it still asks us to do one thing: listen carefully, not to celebrate conquest, not to fear magic, not to be distracted by the gold, but to observe the immense weight of mortality, to hear the echoes of fear, and to appreciate the profound resilience of preservation. Tutankhamun's tomb is both a monument and a confession. It confesses that even kings are human, that even the most powerful civilizations confront chaos. That ritual isn't about mastery, it's a response, a way of coping, and it proves that history, even when silent for centuries, can ultimately speak louder and more truthfully than any royal proclamation or grand inscription. Standing before the artifacts from this tomb, you realize that the concept of eternity has been interpreted in so many ways, through myth, through science, through spectacle. Yet the boy king at the center of it all remains unchanged. He doesn't participate in the stories we tell about him. He is the quiet center, the anchor of truth. The gold, the resin, the shrines, the canes, these are simply the language of people who feared the inevitable, just as we do. In the end, Tutankhamun's tomb teaches a lesson far older than pharaohs or dynasties. It teaches patience, it teaches observation, and most of all, it teaches humility. The king did not conquer history, he survived it. And in surviving, he revealed that the true power of a tomb isn't to impress the gods, or terrify intruders, or preserve a myth. It's to preserve truths, that delicate, fragile, human truth that we so often overlook in our own pursuit of grandeur. And so, the tomb whispers still, not loudly, not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, insistently, waiting for those who can hear it. A reminder that behind every mask, behind every layer of gold, behind every carefully placed shrine, there was a boy, mortal, fragile, and fleeting, and yet, somehow, enduring. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this perspective on history interesting, consider subscribing for more stories that look beyond the surface. We'll see you in the next one.